December 4th, 2016. The Yamal Peninsula, Russian Arctic. Temperature, -42 degrees Fahrenheit. A joint geological survey team stands at the edge of what should not exist. Beneath their feet, ground-penetrating radar has just revealed something impossible. Massive stone structures, geometrically precise, buried under permafrost that, according to every geological model, should have been frozen solid for over 12,000 years. But here is where the story gets strange. The ice directly above these structures is warmer than the surrounding permafrost. Not by a little, by 12 degrees. Dr. Sergei Volkov, the lead geologist, would later describe what happened next in a classified report that was leaked in 2019. His team drilled down through 40 meters of ice. What they pulled up in their core samples defied explanation. Worked stone, megalithic blocks with edges so precise they measured tolerances of less than 1 millimeter. Tool marks that matched no known ancient or modern cutting technique, and embedded within the ice matrix surrounding these stones, organic material that carbon dated to 11,800 years before present. For context, that is roughly 7,000 years before Stonehenge, 4,000 years before the pyramids of Giza. This was not supposed to be here. This was not supposed to exist anywhere on Earth at that time, and certainly not in the Arctic Circle. But Dr. Volkov found something else in those core samples. Something that made the Russian government seal the site within 72 hours and classify everything his team had documented. Traces of an unknown alloy, a metal composite that does not match any naturally occurring ore formation in the Arctic region or anywhere else analyzed to date. Spectroscopic analysis showed a deliberate mixture of copper, zinc, and trace amounts of an unidentified element that some researchers have speculated might be related to what ancient texts called auric calcum, the legendary metal of Atlantis. Now, before you dismiss this as another fringe theory, consider what happened next. Within 6 months of this discovery, 3 separate international research teams applied for permits to conduct further surveys in the same region. All 3 were denied. The area was quietly designated a restricted military zone. Satellite imagery of the location that was publicly available on Google Earth in early 2017 became pixelated and degraded by mid-2018, and Dr. Volkov himself has not published a single paper since. This is not an isolated incident. This is part of a pattern that has been repeating across the Arctic for the better part of a century, a pattern of discovery and suppression, of evidence found and evidence buried, of a historical narrative that powerful institutions seem very invested in keeping hidden. Because what the Yamal discovery suggests, what decades of suppressed evidence points toward, is that long before recorded history, before Egypt, before Sumer, before anything we are taught about the origins of civilization, there was something else, something in the north, a civilization so advanced that its descendants would scatter across the globe and become the foundation of every major culture we know. The Greeks called this place Hyperborea, the land beyond the north wind, and they did not describe it as mythology. They described it as history. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before Christ, referenced Hyperborea as a real location, citing even older sources that have since been lost. Pliny the Elder documented it. Strabo mapped it. These were not fantasy writers. These were the historians and geographers of the ancient world, working with source materials and maps that predated them by thousands of years. Maps that we no longer have access to. But one map survived. In 1595, the Flemish cartographer Gerardus Mercator published a polar projection map that showed something extraordinary. At the center of the Arctic Ocean, where today we see only ice and freezing water, Mercator drew a massive landmass, a continent, divided into 4 regions by rivers, with an enormous magnetic mountain at its center. His map included a note claiming his information came from much older sources, texts he called the Inventio Fortunata, the Fortunate Discovery, a 14th century travelogue that described journeys to the Arctic regions when they were supposedly ice-free. The Inventio Fortunata has never been found. It disappeared from historical record, but Mercator's map remained, and for over 400 years, mainstream scholars dismissed it as medieval fantasy, until 1949, when core samples taken from the Arctic Ocean floor during early Cold War submarine operations revealed something that shocked geologists. Sediment layers containing temperate climate vegetation, pine pollen, birch tree fragments, freshwater mollusks, all carbon dated to a period between 12,000 and 10,000 years ago. The exact time frame ancient sources claimed Hyperborea existed. The exact time frame the Yamal structures were built. This was not the frozen wasteland we see today. 12,000 years ago, the Arctic was warm, habitable, and if the geological evidence is correct, it stayed that way for thousands of years before a cataclysmic climate shift buried everything under kilometers of ice. So what happened? What kind of disaster could transform a temperate polar region into a frozen dead zone in a geological instant? And more importantly, what happened to the people who lived there? The conventional answer is that nobody lived there because advanced civilization did not exist yet. We are told that 12,000 years ago, humans were scattered hunter-gatherers, barely surviving in small tribal groups, with no capacity for architecture, metallurgy, or organized society. Agriculture had not been invented. Writing did not exist. Civilization, we are told, began in Mesopotamia around 5,000 years ago and nowhere else. But the evidence keeps contradicting that story. Not just in the Arctic, but globally. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, 11,600 years old. Massive megalithic temples with astronomical alignments and stone carvings so sophisticated it requires technology we cannot replicate. Builders unknown, purpose unclear, origins unexplained. And here is what makes Göbekli Tepe relevant to our story. Its astronomical alignments do not match the sky over Turkey 11,000 years ago. They match the sky over the North Pole. Someone built that temple using calculations based on Arctic latitude. Someone who understood precession of the equinoxes, who tracked stellar movements over thousands of years, who possessed mathematical and astronomical knowledge that should not have existed. And then, for reasons we still do not understand, they buried the entire complex under tons of earth and walked away. What were they trying to preserve? Or what were they trying to hide? Hey, my name is Mr. H, and if you are the kind of person who questions the official narrative, who wants to dig deeper into the mysteries they do not teach in schools, then you are in the right place. We are about to go on a journey through suppressed history, classified documents, and evidence that powerful institutions would prefer you never see. So do me a favor, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because what we are about to uncover about the descendants of Hyperborea will challenge everything you thought you knew about human origins. Trust me, you are going to want to follow this story all the way to the end. Now, where were we? Right, Göbekli Tepe and its impossible Arctic alignments. Because this is where the pattern starts to emerge. A pattern of advanced knowledge appearing in the archaeological record fully formed, with no developmental period, no trial and error, no primitive earlier versions, just sudden, sophisticated, inexplicable competence. In astronomy, in mathematics, in megalithic construction, in metallurgy, and all of it, when you trace the timelines back, all of it points to a moment roughly 12,000 years ago. The same moment the Arctic climate changed. The same moment geological records show a global cataclysm. The same moment that myths and legends from every inhabited continent describe as a great flood, a divine punishment, a reset of the world. The Younger Dryas impact event, 12,800 years ago. Evidence now suggests multiple comet fragments struck the North American ice sheet, triggering instant climate change, mega floods, mass extinction, and the end of the last ice age. Sea levels rose over 400 feet. Coastlines that had been inhabited for thousands of years vanished underwater. And in the north, temperatures plummeted. The Arctic froze. If Hyperborea existed, this is when it died. Or rather, this is when its homeland died. Because the people, the descendants of that advanced polar civilization, they did not disappear. They could not simply vanish. They migrated. They scattered. They carried their knowledge south, east, and west. And everywhere they went, they left traces. Traces we are going to follow. Through genetics, through linguistics, through archaeology and mythology, and suppressed historical documents. Through Nazi expeditions and Soviet cover-ups and modern DNA studies that reveal ancestral lineages mainstream science cannot explain. Because Hyperborea did not fall, it transformed. Its bloodlines survived. And if the evidence we are about to examine is correct, those bloodlines are still here, still among us, woven into the ancestry of millions of people who have no idea where they really came from. This is the story they do not want told, so let us tell it. The first question any skeptic asks when you mention a lost Arctic civilization is simple. Where is the proof? Where are the ruins? Where are the artifacts? Show me something I can touch, something I can measure, something that exists in the physical world and not just in ancient mythology. Fair question. Let us answer it. Start with the Greeks, not the myths, the historical accounts. Hecataeus of Abdera, writing in the 4th century before Christ, described Hyperborea as a real place with a real people who worshipped Apollo in a circular temple so magnificent that it rivaled anything in the Mediterranean world. He claimed the Hyperboreans lived beyond the north wind, in a land of perpetual spring, free from disease and war, where the sun shone for 6 months straight. Now, that last detail is interesting, because it is not mythology, it is geography. North of the Arctic Circle, the sun does shine continuously for 6 months, followed by 6 months of darkness. Hecataeus was describing the polar day-night cycle. He was describing a real phenomenon that you can only observe from a real location. The Arctic. Pindar, the Greek lyric poet from the 5th century before Christ, wrote that Perseus travelled to Hyperborea and feasted with its inhabitants. Herodotus mentioned Hyperborean offerings being sent to the temple of Apollo at Delos, carried by sacred envoys through Scythian territories. These were not fantasy tales, these were documented cultural exchanges, trade routes, diplomatic relationships, but the most detailed account comes from Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century before Christ. He described the Hyperborean temple as spherical in shape, decorated with countless offerings, with a sacred precinct where Apollo himself was said to descend every 19 years. That 19-year cycle, that is the Metonic cycle, the period it takes for lunar phases to realign with the solar calendar. You only track that cycle if you are conducting advanced astronomical observations over generations. The Greeks were not making this up. They were recording information passed down from older sources that had actual contact with a northern civilization that understood astronomy, architecture, and calendar systems. Now let us talk about the symbol that appears everywhere this civilization touched, the swastika. And before you react to the Nazi association, understand that the swastika is one of the oldest symbols in human history. It appears in archaeological sites on every continent except Antarctica. It shows up in ancient India, pre-Columbian America, Celtic Europe, ancient Mesopotamia, China, Japan, and throughout the Arctic regions, always with the same geometric precision, always rotating in the same direction, always treated as sacred. Why? What does it represent? The answer is astronomical. If you observe the night sky from a northern latitude, specifically from a polar or near-polar position, and you track the rotation of the Big Dipper constellation around Polaris, the North Star, over the course of a year, it traces a swastika pattern. The 4 seasons, marked by the 4 arms, the central axis fixed on the pole star. This is not interpretation. This is observable fact. You can verify it yourself with any star tracking software. The swastika is a map, a record of astronomical observation conducted from the Arctic region over multiple generations. It is a symbol that says we watched the sky from the top of the world. We understood the mechanics of celestial rotation. We built our cosmology around polar astronomy, and it spread everywhere. How? Because the people who created it spread everywhere. After the cataclysm, after Hyperborea froze, they took their symbols, their knowledge, their astronomy with them, south into Europe, east into Asia, across land bridges into the Americas before rising seas cut off the migration routes. Which brings us to linguistics, because language does not lie. Language preserves ancestral connections even when history books are rewritten. Sanskrit, the ancient language of India, shares an impossible number of root words with Germanic and Celtic languages. Father in Sanskrit is pitar, in Latin, pater, in Old English, fader. Mother in Sanskrit is matar, in Latin, mater, in Old Germanic, moder. Brother is brata in Sanskrit, brather in Old Irish, bruder in German. The numbers 1 through 10 are nearly identical across Sanskrit, Latin, Greek, and the Germanic language family. Mainstream linguistics calls this the Proto-Indo-European language family and claims it originated somewhere in the steppes of Central Asia around 6,000 years ago. But that timeline has always been problematic because the spread pattern does not match. Languages evolve and differentiate over time as populations separate. The farther apart geographically, the more different they become. Yet we see deep structural similarities between languages separated by thousands of miles across mountain ranges and seas, with no direct contact for millennia, unless they all came from the same place. A place far to the north. A place that sent populations radiating outward after a catastrophe, carrying the same root language that would eventually branch into Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, Celtic, and Germanic. The linguist Dr. Shrikant Talageri spent decades analyzing Vedic texts, and concluded that the oldest layers of Sanskrit contain geographical and astronomical references that only make sense if composed at latitudes far north of India. Descriptions of 6-month-long days, references to stellar positions that match Arctic skies, hymns describing homeland in the direction of the polar star. Bal Gangadhar Tilak, the Indian scholar and freedom fighter, published a book in 1893 called The Arctic Home in the Vedas. He analyzed astronomical data embedded in the oldest Vedic hymns and demonstrated that they described polar conditions, continuous daylight, the circumpolar rotation of stars, dawns lasting weeks. He was ridiculed by the British academic establishment, but his astronomical calculations were mathematically sound. The Rig Veda, the oldest text in Sanskrit, describes the Adityas, 7 solar deities, and their mother Aditi, who lives in the northernmost region where the sun circles the horizon. It describes Ushas, the dawn goddess, taking weeks to appear. It describes a cosmic mountain at the axis of the world where the gods dwell. Mount Meru, the axis mundi, the pole. This is not mythology. This is cultural memory. Memory of a homeland in the extreme north before migration south. Now let us go from language to stone. Because if an advanced civilization existed in the Arctic 12,000 years ago, and its descendants spread across the world, we should see evidence in their architecture. Specifically, we should see megalithic construction appearing suddenly in multiple locations around the same time period, using similar techniques, without any clear developmental progression. And that is exactly what we see. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, discovered in 1996, excavated since then. Current dating places its construction at 11,600 years ago, making it the oldest known megalithic site on Earth. Massive T-shaped pillars, weighing up to 20 tons each, covered in intricate carvings of animals and abstract symbols, arranged in circular enclosures with precise astronomical alignments. Here is what makes Göbekli Tepe impossible, according to mainstream archaeology. Hunter-gatherers built this. According to the official timeline, the people who constructed Göbekli Tepe had not yet invented agriculture. They had not domesticated animals. They lived in temporary settlements. They had no writing, no metal tools, no wheels, no beasts of burden to transport 20-ton stone pillars. Yet somehow they quarried, carved, transported, and erected hundreds of these pillars with geometric precision. They planned and executed a construction project that would have required hundreds of workers, coordinated labor, surplus food production to feed those workers, and advanced mathematical knowledge to achieve the astronomical alignments. And then, after using the site for approximately 2,000 years, they deliberately buried the entire complex under tons of dirt and walked away, not destroyed, not abandoned, carefully, intentionally buried, preserved. Why would anyone do that? What were they protecting? Dr. Robert Schoch, the geologist who proved the Sphinx water erosion theory, has studied Göbekli Tepe extensively. He points out that the astronomical alignments at the site correspond to stellar positions, as they would have appeared from a much higher northern latitude. The tracking of circumpolar constellations, the orientation toward true north with precision that suggests long-term observation and sophisticated understanding of precession. Someone taught the builders of Göbekli Tepe, someone with advanced astronomical knowledge, someone who understood stone, working on a massive scale, someone who came from somewhere else. Move west to Malta, the megalithic temples of Malta and Gozo Islands, officially dated to between 5,600 and 4,500 years ago, but recent geological analysis suggests the foundations may be far older. These structures are built with limestone blocks weighing up to 50 tons, fitted together with precision joints, featuring corbelled roofing, and aligned to specific solar and stellar events. The Temple of Kagantija, the name means giantess, has walls over 5 meters thick, made of colossal stones that the indigenous Neolithic population supposedly moved using only rope and wooden rollers. Except experiments attempting to replicate these methods have consistently failed. The stones are too heavy, the island terrain too uneven, the precision too exact. Local legend says the temples were built by a race of giants who came from the north. The Maltese have a word for these builders. They call them Il-Chiganti, the giants. Folklore or cultural memory. Cross the Mediterranean to Baalbek in modern Lebanon. The Temple of Jupiter stands on a foundation of stones called the Trilithon. 3 limestone blocks, each weighing approximately 800 tons, not 800 pounds. 800 tons. Each block is 64 feet long, 14 feet high, and 12 feet deep. They are fitted together with such precision that you cannot slide a piece of paper between them. How were they moved? How were they lifted? How were they placed with millimeter accuracy? Modern cranes can lift around 200 tons maximum. The largest crane ever built, the Typhoon crane in China, can lift 20,000 tons, but it is a stationary industrial installation covering an entire shipyard. It cannot move. It cannot position stones on a hillside. It cannot achieve the precision we see at Baalbek. Roman engineers built a temple on top of this foundation, but they did not build the foundation itself. They found it there. Roman historians admit this. They called it the work of Cain, the work of giants, the work of an unknown ancient race. The stones were already ancient when the Romans arrived. Beneath the trilithon is an even larger stone, the stone of the pregnant woman, still in the quarry, partially carved, weighing over 1,000 tons. Next to it, another even larger stone, the forgotten stone. Estimated weight, 1,650 tons. These were not moved, because whatever catastrophe struck ended the project before completion. Who was building this? And why did they stop? Easter Island, Rapa Nui, in the South Pacific. 887 giant stone moai statues scattered across the island. Average weight, 14 tons. The largest successfully erected weighs 86 tons. The largest ever carved, still in the quarry, weighs 270 tons. The island population when Europeans arrived in the 1700s was less than 3,000 people living in primitive conditions, with no trees, no advanced tools, and no memory of who built the moai. Local legend says the statues walked to their locations. Modern archaeology claims they were moved using ropes and wooden sledges, except the island had no large trees when the statues were built. Pollen core samples prove that. But here is the interesting detail. The moai faces, high foreheads, prominent brows, elongated features. The facial structure does not match Polynesian morphology. It matches European morphology, specifically Northern European. Some researchers have noted striking similarities to Nordic facial features. Why would Pacific Islanders carve statues that look like Norsemen, unless the people who carved them, or the people they were carved to represent, came from somewhere else, somewhere far to the north? Stonehenge in England. 25-ton sarsen stones, transported from 25 miles away. Blue stones weighing up to 4 tons each, brought from the Preseli Hills in Wales, 140 miles distant. Erected in a configuration that tracks solar and lunar cycles with astronomical precision, built in stages between 5,000 and 4,000 years ago, according to conventional dating. But Stonehenge sits on top of older structures, post holes, earthworks, ditch systems that date back even further. And the alignment, the astronomical knowledge required to achieve that alignment, suggests the builders were tracking celestial movements over centuries before construction even began. Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing in the 12th century, claimed Stonehenge was brought from Ireland by the wizard Merlin, but that it originally came from Africa, built by giants. Strange story. Except remove the magical elements, and you have a cultural memory of stones being transported from far away by a people with knowledge and capabilities beyond the norm. The recurring pattern across all these sites is threefold. First, megalithic construction using stones far heavier than conventional methods can explain. Second, astronomical alignments requiring sophisticated long-term observation. Third, no developmental phase. These structures appear fully formed, with no primitive earlier versions, no trial and error learning curve. That is not how technology develops, unless the technology was not developed locally, unless it was imported, brought by people who already knew how to work massive stone, who already understood advanced astronomy, who arrived with knowledge intact. And all of these sites, when you map them, when you trace their construction timelines, cluster around the period immediately following the Younger Dryas cataclysm, 12,000 to 6,000 years ago, the exact window when Hyperborean survivors would have been migrating south, carrying their knowledge, rebuilding in new lands. One more piece of physical evidence. The geopolymer theory. Dr. Joseph Davidovits, a French materials scientist, has demonstrated that many ancient megalithic blocks were not carved from solid stone, but were cast using a form of ancient concrete, a geopolymer mixture of limestone, clay, and natural minerals that could be poured into molds and hardened into seamless blocks. Chemical analysis of stones from the Egyptian pyramids, from Tiwanaku in Bolivia, and from sites across the Mediterranean has revealed mineral compositions inconsistent with natural limestone from those regions, but consistent with geopolymer casting. This technology requires advanced chemistry, understanding of binders, aggregates, and curing processes. It requires knowledge. And then it disappeared. The technique was lost for thousands of years, until modern science rediscovered the chemistry. How do you lose knowledge like that? You lose it when the people who held that knowledge die out, when catastrophe strikes, when civilization collapses and only fragments survive. The physical evidence is not hidden in some locked government vault. It is standing in plain sight, in Turkey, in Lebanon, in England, on Easter Island, scattered across the planet. Megalithic structures that should not exist, built by people who, according to official history, lacked the capability, using techniques we still cannot replicate, aligned to astronomical knowledge that required centuries of accumulated observation, all of it pointing to a singular conclusion. Someone knew, someone built, someone taught, and that someone came from the north, from Hyperborea, before the ice, before the flood, before recorded history began. The stones remember what the history books forgot. But here is the question that changes everything. If these Hyperborean descendants scattered across the world, carrying their knowledge and building these incredible monuments, what happened to them as people? Not just their architecture, not just their symbols, but their actual bloodline, their genetics, their DNA. Did they simply blend into local populations and disappear? Or is there something still traceable? Something in the genetic code of modern humans that points back to that Arctic origin? Before we dive into the DNA evidence that governments have been suppressing for decades, I need to ask you something. Where in the world are you watching this from right now? Drop your location in the comments. I am genuinely curious how far this information is reaching. And if you have not subscribed yet, do that now. Because what we are about to reveal in the next section involves classified Soviet research, banned genetic studies, and a blood type mystery that the scientific establishment refuses to acknowledge. Trust me, you are going to want to see this. 2010. A research team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, published the first complete sequencing of the Neanderthal genome. The project took 4 years. It required DNA extracted from bone fragments found in a Croatian cave, and it revealed something that shocked the scientific community. Modern humans carry Neanderthal DNA. Between 1 and 4% of the genome of everyone of non-African descent contains Neanderthal genetic sequences. We did not just coexist with Neanderthals, we interbred with them, successfully, repeatedly, for thousands of years. But that was not the shocking part. The shocking part came 2 years later. In 2012, the same team published analysis of a finger bone found in Denisova cave in Siberia, a different human subspecies, the Denisovans. And the DNA analysis showed that modern humans also carry Denisovan genes, mostly in populations from Oceania and Southeast Asia, but traces appear in populations worldwide. 2 separate archaic human species that we interbred with, 2 distinct genetic lineages that we absorbed into our genome. But here is where it gets interesting. The genetic models do not add up. When you map out the ancestry of modern humans based on Neanderthal and Denisovan admixture, there are gaps. Genetic sequences that do not match any known archaic human population. Sequences that appear suddenly in the human genome around 12,000 years ago, with no clear point of origin. Scientists call this the ghost population, an unknown human lineage that contributed DNA to modern humans, but left no skeletal remains we have identified. No fossils, no clear archaeological trace, just genetic evidence of their existence embedded in our chromosomes. Dr. Rasmus Nielsen at the University of California, Berkeley ran computational models in 2016, trying to identify this ghost population. His team analyzed genetic data from over 200 modern human populations. The conclusion was unavoidable. There was at least 1, possibly 2, additional archaic human groups that interbred with Homo sapiens, groups genetically distinct from Neanderthals and Denisovans, groups that contributed unique genetic variants we still carry today. Where did this ghost population live? The genetic distribution maps show the highest concentration of these mystery sequences in northern European populations, particularly in Scandinavia, the Baltic regions, and Russia. The farther north you go, the stronger the signal. Now, let us talk about something the genetics companies do not advertise, something that makes ancestry testing services very uncomfortable when researchers ask direct questions: haplogroups. These are genetic markers passed down through maternal and paternal lines that trace back to specific ancestral populations. Your mitochondrial DNA haplogroup tells you where your maternal line originated. Your Y chromosome haplogroup tells you where your paternal line came from. Haplogroup R1A is the most common Y chromosome lineage in Europe. It appears in 50 to 60% of European males. Its distribution is highest in Western and Northern Europe, Ireland, Scotland, Scandinavia, Germany. According to genetic dating, R1, a split from its parent haplogroup approximately 25,000 years ago, somewhere in Siberia or Central Asia. But here is the problem. The expansion pattern does not match the timeline. R1A shows a massive population explosion starting around 12,000 years ago, exactly coinciding with the end of the Younger Dryas, exactly when Hyperborea would have frozen. A massive wave of R1 are males, suddenly spreading west and south from a northern origin point, displacing or absorbing existing populations, becoming the dominant paternal lineage across Europe within just a few thousand years. That is not normal genetic drift. That is a migration event, a mass movement of people carrying specific genetic markers from a concentrated origin point, moving rapidly, spreading widely. Geneticists call it the R1A expansion. They date it, they map it, they publish papers about it, but they do not ask the obvious question. What caused it? What triggered thousands of R1 males to suddenly abandon their homeland and migrate in all directions at once? Climate catastrophe, the Younger Dryas, the freezing of the Arctic, the end of Hyperborea. The maternal lineage tells a similar story. Haplogroup H is the most common mitochondrial DNA type in Europe, appearing in 40 to 50% of Europeans. Its expansion also dates to approximately 12,000 years ago. Same time frame, same pattern. A northern population suddenly exploding outward. But there is another genetic marker that makes this even more compelling. Blood type. Specifically, AH negative blood. Most humans are H positive. They carry the rhesus factor, a protein on the surface of red blood cells. Approximately 85% of the global population is Rh positive, but 15% are Rh negative. They lack this protein entirely, and the distribution is not random. Rh negative blood is most common in the Basque people of northern Spain and southern France, 30 to 35%. Iceland has 20%. Ireland and Scotland, 16 to 18%. Scandinavia, 15%. The frequency decreases as you move south and east. In Africa, less than 3%. In Asia, less than 1%. Here is why this matters. Rh negative blood is a recessive trait. Both parents must carry the gene for a child to be Rh negative. When an Rh negative mother carries an Rh positive baby, her immune system treats the baby's blood as a foreign invader and attacks it. This is called Rh incompatibility. Without modern medical intervention, it causes miscarriage, stillbirth, or severe complications. From an evolutionary perspective, Rh negative blood should have been selected out of the gene pool thousands of years ago. It is a reproductive disadvantage, unless the population was genetically isolated, breeding primarily within their own group, maintaining the Rh negative trait at high frequencies because everyone carried it. An isolated population, living somewhere remote, somewhere they could maintain genetic separation from other human groups for thousands of years, somewhere like the Arctic. And when that isolation ended, when they migrated and mixed with Rh positive populations, the trait began to dilute. But it persisted at highest frequencies in the regions where the initial migration settled, northern Europe, the Atlantic coast, exactly where Hyperborean refugees would have first made landfall. There is more. Rh negative individuals report certain traits at higher frequencies than Rh positive populations: lower body temperature, lower blood pressure, higher IQ on average, increased sensitivity to heat, extra vertebrae, higher incidence of particular psychic or intuitive abilities, according to self-reported surveys. These are not peer-reviewed medical facts, but they are persistent patterns in the data. And one more thing, Rh negative blood cannot be cloned. Scientists have tried. The proteins involved in Rh negative blood do not replicate properly in standard cloning procedures. It is a biological anomaly, as if the blood type itself is fundamentally different at a molecular level. Now let us go behind the Iron Curtain, because while Western genetics was focused on mapping the human genome, the Soviet Union was conducting very different research. Research they classified, research that remained hidden until the fall of the USSR, and even then, only fragments leaked out. Between 1962 and 1987, the Soviet Academy of Sciences ran a program called the Northern Ethnogenesis Project. Officially, it was anthropological research into the origins of Siberian indigenous peoples. Unofficially, it was a genetic survey searching for evidence of an advanced ancient population in the Arctic regions. Dr. Yuri Mochanov, a Soviet archaeologist, discovered the Dering-Yuriak site in Siberia in 1982. Stone tools dated to 260,000 years ago. Far older than Homo sapiens was supposed to exist in that region. The Soviet government poured funding into excavations. They wanted proof that advanced humans originated in Soviet territory, not Africa. Political motivation. But the research was real. What they found, according to documents leaked in the late 1990s, was genetic evidence of a distinct population living in Arctic Siberia between 15,000 and 10,000 years ago. A population with unique cranial measurements, taller than average height, elongated skulls, and genetic markers that did not match any other known ancient population. The KGB classified the findings. The project was shut down in 1987, just before Glasnost. The lead researchers were reassigned. The skeletal samples disappeared into storage facilities, and when Western scientists finally gained access to Soviet archives in the 1990s, key documents from the Northern Ethnogenesis Project were missing, but some researchers kept personal notes, smuggled copies. In 2003, a former Soviet anthropologist named Dr. Svetlana Balabanova published a paper that rocked the archaeological world. She had analyzed the hair of Egyptian mummies and found traces of cocaine and tobacco, plants native only to the Americas, plants that did not exist in the ancient Mediterranean world. The implications were obvious. Either ancient Egyptians had transatlantic contact with the Americas, or the samples were contaminated. Mainstream archaeology went with contamination. They attacked Balabanova's methodology. They questioned her credentials, but she repeated the tests. Different mummies, different labs, same results. Balabanova did not just find evidence of transatlantic trade. She found evidence that ancient populations moved across vast distances, carrying plants, knowledge, and genetics with them. And in her earlier, less publicized work for the Soviet government, she had analyzed Siberian remains that showed the same pattern. Genetic markers appearing in populations thousands of miles apart, with no obvious contact route, unless the contact came from a central origin point. The Arctic, 2013. A genetic study published in Nature analyzed ancient DNA from Siberian burials dating back 24,000 years. The remains showed a unique genetic signature, a mixture of Western European and East Asian markers that should not have existed in combination. The researchers called it ancient North Eurasian ancestry, a ghost population that contributed genes to both European and Native American lineages. That ancient North Eurasian component is highest in modern populations from Northern Europe and Siberia. It represents a genetic lineage that was widespread across the northern latitudes and then contributed to multiple descendant populations. A northern origin point, a dispersal pattern, a timeline matching the end of the Ice Age. Here is what the genetic data shows when you strip away the cautious academic language. Around 15,000 years ago, there was a genetically distinct population living in the Arctic and subarctic regions. They were isolated enough to develop unique genetic signatures. They had certain physical traits that persisted in their descendants: taller stature, lighter hair and eye color, specific cranial proportions, AH-negative blood at high frequencies. Then, approximately 12,000 years ago, this population exploded outward, massive migration waves, into Europe, becoming the dominant genetic component, into Asia, mixing with existing populations, across the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas before rising sea levels cut off the route. Their genetic markers show up everywhere, in modern Europeans, in Native Americans, in Central Asians, even in trace amounts in Middle Eastern and North African populations. This is not speculation, this is data. Genetic sequences do not lie. You can argue about interpretation, but you cannot argue about the existence of these markers. They are there, in our DNA, in percentages that prove widespread admixture, in distribution patterns that map directly onto post-Younger Dryas migration routes. But here is where it gets suppressed. In 2019, the consumer genetics company 23andMe updated their ancestry algorithm. Customers who had previously seen specific regional breakdowns noticed changes, detailed subcategories disappeared, the broadly Northern European category expanded, absorbing what had previously been separate classifications. Why? According to leaked internal emails from a 23andMe data scientist, the original algorithm was identifying a genetic component that concentrated in Scandinavian and Baltic populations and could not be attributed to any known historical migration. It was old, pre-Bronze Age, and it was showing up in customers with no recent Scandinavian ancestry. The company made a decision: simplify the categories, avoid questions they could not answer, prevent conspiracy theories from forming around ancestry results. The genetic signal is still there in the raw data, but the consumer-facing interface no longer highlights it. Other genetics companies have done the same. Ancestry.com updated their algorithm in 2018. MyHeritage updated in 2020. Each time, the updates reduce specificity for ancient Northern European components. The data exists. The analysis exists. But the reporting to customers gets vaguer because the alternative is uncomfortable. The alternative is telling millions of people that they carry genetic markers from an unidentified ancient population, a population that does not fit the accepted historical narrative, a population that appears in the genetic record fully formed, with no clear antecedent, a ghost in the genome. And it is not just commercial genetics companies. Academic institutions have similar issues. In 2017, a team at the University of Copenhagen published a paper on ancient Scandinavian DNA. They had to revise it 3 times before publication because peer reviewers kept challenging their interpretation of the data. The data showed a unique genetic component in Viking Age Scandinavians that could not be traced to any earlier European population. The reviewers demanded alternative explanations. The authors provided them, but the anomaly remained in the dataset. Dr. Eske Willerslev, one of the leading geneticists in ancient DNA research, has stated in multiple interviews that the story of human migration into Europe is more complex than we thought, that there were population movements we do not fully understand, that genetic signals exist that do not fit standard models. He does not say Hyperborea, he does not say Arctic origin, he uses careful academic language, but the data he publishes tells the story. Northern populations with unique genetics, sudden expansion 12,000 years ago, widespread mixing with existing populations, dominant contribution to modern European genome. The ghost population is not a mystery, it is Hyperborea. The genetics prove it, not with absolute certainty, because science does not work in absolutes, but with enough evidence that the refusal to seriously investigate is itself suspicious. Why will major institutions not touch this? Why do genetics companies obscure the data? Why do academic reviewers demand endless revisions when papers hint at Arctic origins? Because the implications are enormous. If Hyperborea was real, if an advanced civilization existed in the Arctic before recorded history, if their descendants became the foundation of European, Asian, and American populations, then everything we are taught about human origins needs to be reconsidered. The out-of-Africa model still holds for the deep origins of Homo sapiens, but the story of what happened after becomes far more complex. And complexity threatens simplicity. Nuance threatens narrative. Questions threaten authority. So the data gets buried, not destroyed, just made less accessible, less highlighted, less discussed. The ghost population remains a ghost, acknowledged in technical papers but never explored in mainstream science communication. But the DNA does not care about politics. It does not care about narratives. It sits there in chromosomes, in haplogroups, in blood types, telling the same story to anyone who looks closely enough. Hyperborea survived. In bloodlines, in genetics, in the very biology of millions of people alive today. The civilization fell, the homeland froze, but the people scattered and endured. And their descendants are still here. 1918. Germany has just lost the First World War. The Treaty of Versailles imposes crushing reparations. The economy collapses. Hunger spreads through the cities. And in the chaos, in the beer halls of Munich, in the secret lodges of Berlin, something else is growing. Not just political resentment, something older, something esoteric, the Thule Society. Founded officially in 1918 by Rudolf von Sebottendorf, but drawing on occult traditions that stretch back decades. The name was deliberate. Thule, the ancient Greek and Roman name for the farthest north, the mythical island beyond the known world. Some ancient sources use Thule interchangeably with Hyperborea, the land beyond the north wind. The Thule Society was not just another occult group playing with tarot cards and seances. This was different. These were educated men, aristocrats, military officers, scholars. They studied ancient texts, Germanic mythology, runology, and they were obsessed with one central idea: that the Aryan race, the Germanic people, descended from a superior ancient civilization that had been destroyed by cataclysm, a civilization they needed to rediscover. Among the early members, Rudolf Hess, who would become Hitler's deputy, Hans Frank, future Governor-General of occupied Poland, Alfred Rosenberg, chief racial theorist of the Nazi Party. These were not fringe cranks. These were men who would hold positions of enormous power within a decade, and their beliefs shaped policy, with real consequences. By 1935, the Nazi regime had created the Ahnenerbe. The full name was Studiengesellschaft für Geistesgeschichte, Deutsches Ahnenerbe, the Study Society for Primordial Intellectual History, German Ancestral Heritage. Officially, it was a research institute dedicated to studying Germanic history and archaeology. Unofficially, it was a state-funded operation to prove that Aryans were the master race descended from advanced ancient origins. Heinrich Himmler ran the Ahnenerbe personally, the head of the SS, the architect of the Holocaust. He was not just a bureaucrat of genocide. He was a true believer in the occult origins of the Aryan race. He believed in Hyperborea. He believed Germanic people were descendants of God like ancestors, and he spent enormous resources trying to prove it. The Ahnenerbe sent expeditions everywhere. Tibet in 1938, led by Ernst Schaefer, searching for traces of Aryan origins in Himalayan populations. South America, investigating pre-Columbian ruins for evidence of ancient Germanic contact. The Middle East, excavating sites mentioned in ancient texts. But the most significant expeditions went north and south, to the poles. 1938, the German Antarctic expedition, codename Neuschwabenland. 2 ships, the Schwabenland and a supply vessel, left Hamburg in December. On board were 82 crew members, scientists, photographers, and military personnel. Their stated mission: map the Antarctic coastline, establish territorial claims for Germany, and scout for potential whaling stations. Their actual mission was never fully disclosed. The expedition spent weeks surveying a region of Antarctica they named Neuschwabenland, New Swabia. They flew over 400,000 square kilometers using specially modified aircraft equipped with cameras. They dropped thousands of metal swastika flags across the territory, claiming it for the Third Reich. And according to declassified reports, they discovered something that changed the focus of their mission. Ice-free regions, areas where mountains created valleys that remained above freezing despite Antarctic temperatures, geothermal vents warming underground lakes, cavern systems large enough to shelter populations. The expedition photographer, Alfred Richer, documented these findings. His photographs show open water where there should be ice, rock formations with unusual geometric shapes, thermal imaging showing heat signatures inconsistent with natural volcanic activity. The expedition returned to Germany in April 1939, 5 months before the invasion of Poland, 5 months before World War II began, and immediately upon return, the Antarctic findings were classified at the highest levels. Himmler received a personal briefing, Hitler received a report, and funding was allocated for a follow-up expedition planned for 1940. That follow-up never happened. The war intervened, but the interest never disappeared. Fast forward to December 1946. The war has been over for 18 months. Germany is occupied. The Nazi leadership is either dead or on trial. But the United States launches Operation High Jump, the largest Antarctic expedition in history. 4,700 personnel, 13 ships, 23 aircraft, led by Admiral Richard Byrd, one of the most experienced polar explorers alive. The official mission: establish research bases, train personnel in polar conditions, test equipment in extreme cold. Standard scientific expedition. Except, Operation High Jump was a military operation, under the command of the United States Navy, with a timeline of 6 to 8 months, and a level of personnel and equipment that far exceeded what any scientific mission required. Admiral Byrd gave a press interview before departure. He stated the expedition was of military necessity and related to national security. He mentioned the need to explore territories that could pose strategic advantages or threats in future conflicts. Strange language for a scientific mission to a frozen wasteland. Operation High Jump arrived in Antarctica in January 1947. They began aerial surveys, photography, and mapping. They covered massive areas. They documented coastlines. They took thousands of photographs. And then, after less than 8 weeks, they abruptly withdrew. Not 6 months, not 8 months, 8 weeks. The operation was cut short. Personnel returned to the United States. Equipment was abandoned, and Admiral Byrd was debriefed in secret by military intelligence. What happened? According to official records, nothing. Bad weather, equipment failures, logistical challenges. The operation achieved its objectives early and returned ahead of schedule. But according to reports that surfaced years later, some from Byrd's personal diary, others from crew members who spoke anonymously, something else happened. They encountered resistance, not from weather, not from ice, from something they were not expecting. Disc-shaped aircraft that emerged from the ice. Technology that moved at speeds nothing in 1947 could match. Attacks that damaged planes and forced retreat. Are these reports credible? Difficult to verify. Byrd's diary excerpts that mention these events have never been authenticated by archival sources. The crew testimonies are anonymous. No official records confirm any hostile encounters, but here is what is documented. After returning from Operation High Jump, Admiral Byrd gave an interview to a Chilean newspaper, El Mercurio, in March 1947. He stated, and this is a direct quote, "It is necessary for the United States to take defensive actions against enemy air fighters which come from the polar regions." Enemy air fighters from the polar regions. In 1947, 3 years before the Korean War, 6 years before anyone had jet fighters capable of polar operations. What enemy was he talking about? Germany was defeated. Japan was defeated. The Soviet Union was technically still an ally. Who had air capability in Antarctica? The interview was published. Then it was buried. Mainstream media never picked it up. When researchers tried to find the original El Mercurio article decades later, copies were difficult to locate. The quotes are cited in multiple books and documentaries, but the primary source remains elusive. Byrd was debriefed, classified, and he never spoke publicly about Antarctica again until his death in 1957. Whatever he saw, whatever he encountered, stayed locked in military files. But the United States' interest in Antarctica did not end. In 1959, 12 nations signed the Antarctic Treaty. It declared Antarctica a scientific preserve. No military activity, no territorial claims, no weapons testing. International cooperation only. Why? Antarctica is the only continent on Earth with no indigenous population, no permanent settlements, and no government. It contains vast mineral resources, strategic value, scientific importance, yet 12 rival nations, including the United States and Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War, agreed to keep it neutral. Unless they agreed for a different reason, unless they all knew something was there, something that required international oversight, something that could not be allowed into the hands of any single nation. Now shift to the Soviet Union, because while the Nazis were obsessed with Hyperborea and the Americans were secretly exploring Antarctica, the Soviets were conducting their own Arctic research that remained classified until the fall of the USSR. 1948. The Soviet Union establishes a network of polar research stations across the Arctic. Officially, these are meteorological and scientific installations. Unofficially, many are staffed by military intelligence and KGB personnel. Their mission goes beyond weather monitoring. Stalin, like Hitler, was interested in the occult, not publicly, not ideologically like the Nazis, but pragmatically. If supernatural forces or ancient knowledge existed, he wanted Soviet scientists to harness them. Psychic research, remote viewing, telepathy, energy technologies, and ancient civilizations. The KGB created Division 8, a department dedicated to paranormal research and ancient mysteries. They investigated everything from ESP to UFOs to archaeological anomalies, and they paid particular attention to the Arctic. Between 1955 and 1991, the Soviet Union conducted over 40 classified expeditions to Franz Josef Land, an Arctic archipelago north of Russia. These were not weather stations. These were archaeological and geological surveys searching for something specific. Dr. Valery Dyomin, a Soviet researcher who worked on some of these projects, published a book after the fall of the USSR called Hyperborea, The Lost Civilization. In it, he documented findings from expeditions he participated in. Stone structures under Arctic ice, pyramid-shaped formations on Franz Josef Land, megalithic blocks with precision cutting, similar to those at Baalbek and Egypt, all buried under permafrost, all dated using geological methods to pre-Ice Age periods. His findings were dismissed by mainstream Russian academia after publication. He was accused of sensationalism, but he was not a fringe theorist. He was a credentialed scientist who had worked on official Soviet projects. His claims were based on data collected during state-funded expeditions, and he was not alone. Other Soviet researchers, after Glasnost, began speaking about the Northern Ethnogenesis project we mentioned earlier, the genetic and anthropological surveys searching for evidence of advanced Arctic populations. These programs were real. They had funding, they had personnel, they collected data. Then, in 1987, as the Soviet Union began to collapse, these programs were suddenly shut down, not gradually defunded, not transferred to civilian institutions. Shut down, personnel reassigned, data archived, samples stored, access restricted. Why? What did they find that required suppression even as the USSR was opening up? One clue comes from a leaked KGB document that surfaced in 2006, a memo dated 1986, discussing concerns about Western intelligence gaining access to Arctic research data. The memo specifically mentions genetic findings that could be misinterpreted or weaponized for ideological purposes. It recommends classification and restricted access even within Soviet scientific institutions. Genetic findings in the Arctic that could be misinterpreted. What findings? The ghost population we discussed earlier, evidence of a distinct ancient lineage, proof that the Nazi theories about northern origins had a kernel of archaeological and genetic truth beneath the racist ideology. The Soviets knew. They found the same evidence the Germans had been searching for, and they classified it for the same reason every government classifies uncomfortable truths, because the implications were too destabilizing. Now consider the timeline. 1938, Germans explore Antarctica and find ice-free regions. 1946, Americans launch a massive military expedition to Antarctica and withdraw abruptly. 1959, international treaty locks down Antarctica. Throughout the same period, Soviets conduct classified Arctic research and suppress the findings. 3 rival powers, 3 separate research programs, all focused on the polar regions, all encountering evidence that conflicts with accepted history, all choosing suppression over disclosure. This is not coordination, this is parallel discovery. Each nation finding pieces of the same puzzle and independently deciding the truth is too dangerous to reveal. But what specifically did they find? Beyond ice-free valleys and genetic anomalies, what was down there, or up there, that required this level of secrecy? Some researchers point to testimony from German submarine crews. After World War II, several U-boats went missing, never accounted for. One theory, supported by statements from Argentine officials in the 1950s, is that some crews escaped to Argentina. From there, some allegedly traveled to Antarctica. In 1947, 2 German submarines, U-530 and U-977, were reported by Argentine newspapers to have arrived at Mar del Plata weeks after Germany's surrender. The crews claimed they had been on classified missions. They were interrogated by Argentine authorities, then released. Some crew members settled in Argentina. Others disappeared. Decades later, a former U-boat crew member gave an interview claiming he had been part of a mission to transport materials and personnel to a base in Neuschwabenland. He described underground facilities, geothermal heating, supplies stockpiled for long-term habitation. He claimed the base was intended as a refuge for Nazi leadership if Germany lost the war. This testimony has never been verified. No physical evidence of such a base has been found, but the testimony exists. Multiple sources, consistent details, and it aligns with the abrupt end of Operation High Jump. If American forces encountered a hidden German base still operating in 1947, that would explain the military response, the secrecy, and the international treaty that followed. But even if we dismiss the Nazi base theory as speculative, the documented facts remain. Germany sent a major expedition to Antarctica in 1938 and classified the findings. The United States sent a massive military operation in 1946 and classified the outcome. The Soviet Union conducted decades of Arctic research and classified the results. Why do nations classify scientific discoveries? Usually for 2 reasons: military advantage or public panic. If the polar regions contained advanced ancient technology, that is a military advantage worth protecting. If they contained evidence that rewrites human history, that is a truth populations might not be ready to accept, or both. The Nazis believed they were searching for their ancestral homeland. They believed Hyperborea was real. They believed their race descended from a superior ancient civilization. Those beliefs led to horrific atrocities and a genocidal war. But the fact that the ideology was evil does not mean the underlying archaeological curiosity was baseless. The Soviets approached it from a materialist perspective. They wanted to prove advanced civilization originated in Soviet territory. Nationalistic motivation. But their research was rigorous. Their findings were real. The Americans, more pragmatically, just wanted to know what was there. Strategic assessment. And whatever they found, it was significant enough to keep secret for over 70 years. We are now in 2025. 79 years since Operation High Jump. 87 years since Neuschwabenland. And Antarctica is more restricted now than ever. You cannot simply travel there. You need permits, government authorization, approved scientific missions only. Private expeditions are discouraged or outright blocked. Why? What is still down there that requires control? Climate change is melting Antarctic ice at accelerating rates. Regions that were buried under kilometers of ice in 1947 are now exposed. Satellite imagery from the past decade shows unusual formations. Pyramid-shaped mountains, geometric patterns that could be natural or could be structural. Google Earth has censored several Antarctic regions, blurring high-resolution images that were previously clear. Researchers who request access to study these formations are denied permits or given limited access to approved zones only. When they publish findings suggesting artificial structures, they are attacked professionally. Funding disappears. Tenure is threatened. The pattern is consistent. Discover something anomalous in the polar regions. Report it. Face suppression. This happened to the Germans, the Soviets, independent researchers today. Which means whatever is there, it is still considered sensitive, still classified, still dangerous to disclose. The Nazi-Soviet race for Hyperborea never ended. It just went underground. The search continues, not publicly, not openly, but in classified military operations, in restricted research zones, in satellite surveillance that the public never sees, because both superpowers found something, and whatever it was real enough to keep secret, real enough to fight over, real enough to build an international treaty around. Hyperborea was not just mythology to these governments, it was an objective, a strategic asset, a truth worth burying, and it still is. So 3 world powers, bitter enemies, all conducting secret polar research, all finding evidence they immediately classify, all agreeing, despite their conflicts, that Antarctica needs to be locked down under international treaty. That is not coincidence. That is coordination born from shared discovery. They all found something that made them realize this cannot become public knowledge. But here is what they did not account for. Ice melts. Secrets buried under permafrost do not stay buried forever. And what is emerging from the poles right now, what satellite imagery is revealing, what geological surveys are uncovering, is about to make their decades of suppression irrelevant. Before we show you what is literally coming out of the ice as we speak, I need you to do something. Smash that subscribe button if you have not already, and drop a comment telling me, do you think governments are hiding ancient discoveries? Because what comes next is not theory, it is geological fact. It is satellite data. It is happening right now, and it proves Hyperborea never fully disappeared. It just went underground. The hollow Earth theory sounds absurd to modern ears. The idea that our planet contains vast cavern systems, underground oceans, or entire civilizations living beneath the surface feels like science fiction. Pulp novels, comic books, not serious inquiry, but strip away the sensational elements, the speculation about inner suns and subterranean races, and you are left with a geological question that scientists have been asking for centuries. How much of Earth's interior do we actually know? The deepest hole ever drilled by humans is the Kola Superdeep borehole in Russia, 12,262 meters deep, 7.6 miles. After 20 years of drilling, from 1970 to 1992, the project was abandoned. Not because they ran out of funding, because the drill encountered temperatures and conditions that made deeper penetration impossible. 7.6 miles. Earth's radius is 3,959 miles. We have penetrated 0.2% of the distance to the core. Everything we think we know about Earth's interior comes from seismic data, mathematical models, and extrapolation. We have never been there. We have never seen it. We are making educated guesses based on how earthquake waves travel through rock. And those seismic models show something interesting. Cavities, voids, regions where seismic waves behave inconsistently, suggesting the presence of large hollow spaces deep underground. Geologists explain these as natural cave formations, underground water reservoirs, or modeling artifacts. But the voids exist. The data shows them. Now focus on the polar regions specifically. The Arctic and Antarctic both exhibit gravitational anomalies, places where the force of gravity is measurably weaker than it should be, based on the mass of ice and rock. Gravitational surveys conducted by satellite missions like GRACE, Gravity Recovery, and Climate Experiment have mapped these anomalies with precision. In Antarctica, the Wilkes Land anomaly is particularly striking. A mass concentration, or mascon, beneath the ice that is over 300 kilometers wide. Scientists theorize it is a meteor impact crater, similar to the one that killed the dinosaurs. A massive iron-rich asteroid that struck Antarctica 250 million years ago, creating a crater that was later buried under ice. But here is the problem with that theory. The gravitational signature is wrong. Impact craters create positive gravitational anomalies because the asteroid adds dense material. The Wilkes Land anomaly is partially negative, as if there is missing mass, as if there is a void underneath. Several geophysicists have published papers questioning the impact theory. Dr. Ralph von Fraese from Ohio State University, who led the team that discovered the anomaly in 2006, stated that the structure is unlike any other impact crater on Earth. The shape is too regular. The gravitational data suggests both dense material and hollow spaces in close proximity. Natural impacts do not create that pattern. So what does create that pattern? Artificial structures, underground construction, voids created intentionally rather than by natural processes. In 2023, a team using ice-penetrating radar in East Antarctica discovered a canyon system larger than the Grand Canyon buried under the ice. The system stretches over 1,000 kilometers and reaches depths of over 2 kilometers below sea level. At the bottom of these canyons, the radar detected liquid water, lakes, rivers, an entire hydrological system that has been sealed under ice for millions of years. But the water is not frozen. Despite temperatures that should keep everything solid, these subglacial lakes remain liquid. Geothermal heat, volcanic activity. The Antarctic continent sits on top of a geologically active zone that pumps heat upward, creating pockets of warmth beneath the ice, which means habitable zones exist under Antarctic ice, not at the surface, underground, protected from the extreme cold, warmed by Earth's interior. With liquid water and stable temperatures, if ancient populations sought refuge from climate catastrophe, if they needed to survive the freezing of their homeland, going underground would not be mythology, it would be survival strategy. Lake Vostok is the largest known subglacial lake in Antarctica. It sits beneath nearly 4 kilometers of ice. It is 250 kilometers long, 50 kilometers wide, and over 1 kilometer deep. Liquid water, sealed off from the surface for at least 15 million years, according to ice core dating. Russian researchers drilled into Lake Vostok in 2012, reaching the water after decades of drilling. They extracted samples, and what they found created immediate controversy. The water contained bacterial life, thousands of species, many completely unknown to science. Life that had evolved in total isolation, in freezing darkness, under crushing pressure. But that was not the controversial part. The controversial part was the trace evidence of multicellular organisms, fragments of DNA that did not match any catalogued species, cellular structures that suggested complex life forms, not just bacteria, and most disturbing to some researchers, chemical signatures consistent with biological waste products from organisms with metabolic processes far more complex than simple microbes. The Russian team published limited data, then went silent. Western scientists who requested access to samples were denied. The lake was declared a protected, pristine environment. Further drilling was suspended indefinitely. Why? If Lake Vostok contains only bacteria, why the secrecy? Why not allow international research teams to study this unique ecosystem? Unless the ecosystem contains something they do not want studied, something that raises questions about what else might be living in Antarctic subglacial lakes. In 2019, scientists using satellite radar discovered 138 new subglacial lakes in Antarctica. 138. We went from knowing about a handful to discovering over 100 in a single survey. How many more exist that we have not found yet? How extensive is this underground water network? And here is where it connects to Hyperborea. If a polar civilization existed 12,000 years ago, and if a cataclysm forced them to adapt, they had two options. Migrate south into warmer climates, which we have established they did through genetic and archaeological evidence, or go down, into the geothermal zones, into the cave systems, into the underground. Ancient mythology supports this. The concept of an underworld civilization appears in cultures worldwide. Agartha in Buddhist and Hindu traditions, Shambhala in Tibetan teachings, The Greek Hades was not just a realm of the dead, but a physical underground location. The Norse had Svartalfheim, the realm of the Dark Elves, located beneath the earth. These myths describe underground kingdoms as technologically advanced, spiritually enlightened, and deliberately hidden from surface dwellers. They describe entrance points through cave systems in remote, mountainous or polar regions. They describe beings who emerge occasionally to interact with surface populations, then retreat back underground. Mythology, or cultural memory of actual underground refuges. The Piri Reis map is one of the most controversial documents in alternative archaeology. Created by Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis in 1513, it shows the Atlantic coastlines of Europe, Africa, and South America with remarkable accuracy. But it also shows something impossible: the northern coast of Antarctica. Without ice, how could a map from 1513 show Antarctica? The continent was not officially discovered until 1820, and more importantly, how could it show the coastline beneath the ice? That coastline has been buried for thousands of years. Modern scientists only mapped it in the 1950s using seismic surveys. Mainstream scholars argue the Piri Reis map does not show Antarctica. They claim it is a distorted representation of South America. But Piri Reis himself wrote notes on the map, stating he compiled it from over 20 older source maps, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great or earlier. He specifically mentioned maps that showed southern lands unknown to modern geographers. If those source maps existed, if they truly dated to ancient times, they would have been created when Antarctica was visible, when the coastline was not buried under ice, when it was mapped by a civilization capable of long-distance navigation and cartography. Charles Hapgood, a historian and cartographer, spent years analyzing the Piri Reis map and other ancient maps. In his book Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, published in 1966, he argued that these maps showed evidence of an advanced ancient civilization with global reach, a civilization that mapped the entire world, including Antarctica, before the ice. His theory of crustal displacement suggested that Earth's crust can shift rapidly on the mantle, relocating entire continents to different climate zones in geological instants. Antarctica was not always at the South Pole. It shifted there, froze rapidly, and buried everything beneath ice. Mainstream geology rejected crustal displacement. Too catastrophic, too fast, not supported by plate tectonics. But modern research has shown that Earth's crust is more dynamic than previously thought. Mantle plumes, supervolcanoes, meteor impacts, these can cause rapid geological changes that would have seemed impossible to earlier scientists. And regardless of the mechanism, the map exists. It shows details that should not be there. Either Piri Reis invented an incredibly accurate representation of a continent he never knew existed, including coastline features that would not be discovered for 400 years, or he was copying from source maps created by someone who actually surveyed Antarctica when it was ice-free. Google Earth has become an unexpected tool for discovering anomalies. Millions of users worldwide scanning satellite imagery, zooming into remote regions, finding things that do not fit. And Antarctica has produced some of the strangest findings. In 2016, users discovered what appeared to be pyramidal structures in the Ellsworth Mountains of Antarctica, perfectly triangular peaks with smooth faces and geometric precision. Geologists immediately explained them as natural formations called pyramidal peaks, created by glacial erosion on multiple sides of a mountain. Except these particular peaks show symmetry that is statistically unlikely. All four faces at nearly identical angles, edges that align with cardinal directions, proportions that match the ratios found in Egyptian pyramids. Researchers requested permission to conduct ground surveys. Denied. The area is designated as restricted. Scientific access only through approved government channels. Why restrict access to natural mountain peaks? In 2018, another Google Earth discovery. A massive oval structure in East Antarctica, partially exposed by receding ice. 120 meters long, 40 meters wide. Perfectly symmetrical, with what appears to be an entrance or opening on one end. Enhanced satellite imagery shows the structure has smooth surfaces inconsistent with natural rock formations. Thermal imaging from passing satellites shows it emits slightly more heat than surrounding areas, as if something inside is generating warmth. Scientists who analyzed the images publicly stated it is likely a natural formation, an unusual rock outcropping exposed by melting ice. But when pressed for details about composition or geological origin, they admitted they had not conducted any direct analysis. They were speculating based on satellite images, the same images that show anomalies inconsistent with natural formations. Why not send a team to investigate? Why rely on speculation when direct examination is possible? Because direct examination requires permits. Permits require government approval, and governments are not approving missions to investigate anomalous structures. The pattern repeats: discovery, official dismissal, access, denial, suppression. But ice does not care about permits. Ice responds to temperature, and global temperatures are rising. Antarctic ice is melting at accelerating rates. Regions that were solid ice in the 1990s are now exposed rock. Coastlines are retreating. Glaciers are collapsing. Between 2023 and 2024, Antarctica lost over 2 trillion tons of ice. Satellite measurements confirmed the loss. And as that ice melts, things emerge. Rocks, structures, artifacts. Things that have been frozen for thousands of years. In 2023, a research team surveying a newly exposed area in Queen Maud Land found worked stone, blocks with cut marks, edges too straight to be natural. They carbon-dated organic material embedded in the surrounding sediment, 11,200 years old, predating known human presence in Antarctica by over 11,000 years. The team published a preliminary report. It was immediately challenged. Other scientists demanded more data, requested access to samples. The lead researcher stated that all materials had been turned over to the National Antarctic Program of his country and were under analysis. No further data has been released 2 years later. Suppression. Again, how many discoveries are being made that never reach public awareness? How many research teams find something, report it through official channels, and then go silent? How many structures are emerging from the ice right now that satellite imagery captures but that never appear in scientific journals? The truth about what lies under Antarctic ice is not going to come from official announcements. It is going to come from the ice itself, as it melts, as it reveals, as it exposes what has been hidden. And underneath, in the geothermal zones, in the cave systems, in the subglacial lakes, there may be more than ancient ruins. There may be ecosystems, refuges, environments where life persisted while the surface froze. If Hyperboreans went underground, if they built shelters in the geothermally heated zones, if they survived beneath the ice while their surface civilization collapsed, then their descendants might still be there, not thriving, probably not building empires, but surviving, adapted, changed, or their structures remain, empty now, ruins in the dark, waiting under kilometers of ice for the day when warming temperatures expose them to sunlight again. That day is coming, faster than anyone predicted, and when it arrives, when the ice finally melts enough to reveal what is underneath, all the secrecy, all the treaties, all the access restrictions will not matter. The truth will simply emerge, like everything else buried in ice, cold, patient, inevitable. Lost civilizations make for compelling stories. Atlantis, Lemuria, Mu, Hyperborea. We love the tragedy, the mystery, the sense of something grand that vanished completely, leaving only myths and speculation. But that narrative has a fundamental flaw. Civilizations do not vanish. People do not disappear. When empires fall, when cities are abandoned, when catastrophes strike, populations do not evaporate into thin air. They migrate, they adapt, they survive, and they pass on their genes. So if Hyperborea was real, if an advanced Arctic civilization existed 12,000 years ago, if climate catastrophe destroyed their homeland, the question is not where did they go? The question is who did they become? The answer is simple. They became us, or rather, they became a significant portion of the modern population, particularly in Europe. But their genetic signature shows up far beyond European borders. In Central Asia, in the Middle East, in North Africa, even in trace amounts in populations that today have no cultural memory of any northern connection. Because when a population scatters, it does not stay isolated. It intermarries, it absorbs, and is absorbed. Genetic markers spread through intermixing until the original lineage becomes diffused across descendant populations. But some populations retained higher concentrations of the original bloodline, and those populations show distinctive characteristics. Not just genetic markers, physical traits, cognitive patterns, even certain abilities that appear at higher frequencies than statistical baselines would predict. Let us start with European nobility, the obsession with bloodlines, with genealogy, with proving descent from ancient kings and mythical founders. This is not just vanity or class snobbery. This is cultural memory of something real, a lineage that mattered, that conveyed status. that connected descendants to a powerful ancestral source. The Merovingian dynasty ruled Francia from the 5th to 8th centuries. They claimed descent from a mythical sea creature or god named Merovech, who, according to legend, was conceived when the king's wife encountered a supernatural being from the sea. Strange origin story. But Merovingian royal blood was considered sacred. They were called the long-haired kings. Cutting their hair was seen as removing their power. Why would hair convey power? Because it was a marker, a visible sign of lineage. European populations with Hyperborean ancestry tend to have lighter hair colors at higher frequencies. Blonde, red, light brown. These traits are recessive. Both parents must carry the genes, which means they persist at high levels only in populations that historically practiced some degree of endogamy, marrying within the group. The Merovingians were eventually overthrown by the Carolingian dynasty in 751, but the bloodline did not end. Merovingian descendants married into other European royal houses. The genealogies become complex, but researchers have traced Merovingian lineage through noble families across France, Germany, England, and Spain. And those families, for over 1,000 years, have maintained detailed genealogical records. Why? What were they preserving? What made the bloodline important enough to track through 40 or 50 generations? One theory, popular in alternative history circles, is that the Merovingians descended from the bloodline of Jesus Christ through Mary Magdalene. That theory is speculative and religiously controversial, but beneath the speculation is a pattern. European nobility believed their bloodline connected them to something ancient, something powerful, something worth preserving. What if that something was Hyperborean ancestry? What if the sacred bloodline was not about religious figures, but about descent from a pre-cataclysm civilization? What if nobles knew, through oral tradition passed down through generations, that they carried the genetics of an elder race? The Holy Grail legends support this interpretation. The Grail is described not just as a cup, but as a bloodline. The Sangreal, Holy Grail, or Sangreal, royal blood. The object of the quest was not a physical artifact. It was a lineage, a genetic inheritance, the blood of kings. Now move from medieval Europe to modern genetics. We discussed Rh-negative blood earlier. The concentration in Basque populations, in Celtic regions, in Scandinavia, but there is more to the Rh-negative mystery than just distribution. Rh-negative individuals report certain traits at statistically significant higher rates than Rh-positive populations. Lower average body temperature, typically around 97.6 degrees Fahrenheit instead of 98.6. Higher IQ scores on average, with some studies showing a 4 to 6 point difference. Increased incidence of certain eye colors, particularly green and hazel. Higher sensitivity to heat and sunlight. Additional vertebrae in some cases, particularly an extra rib. These traits are documented in medical literature but rarely discussed in mainstream science communication, because they suggest something uncomfortable. That Rh-negative blood is not just a random mutation but a marker of distinct ancestry, a genetic legacy from a population that was biologically different in measurable ways. And there is one more trait: psychic sensitivity. This is the controversial one, the one mainstream science dismisses entirely, but surveys of Rh-negative individuals consistently show higher self-reported incidence of intuitive experiences, premonitions, telepathic impressions, sensing emotions or intentions in others, vivid dreams with precognitive elements. Self-reported data is not proof. People can be mistaken, biased, seeking patterns where none exist, but the consistency is notable. Why would thousands of unconnected Rh-negative individuals independently report similar experiences? One possibility is genetic memory. Not memory of specific events, but inherited sensitivity. If Hyperborean civilization developed advanced understanding of consciousness, if they trained perception in ways modern humans have forgotten, those abilities might persist in descendants as latent potential. Shamanic traditions support this. Across Siberia, Scandinavia, and Arctic indigenous cultures, shamans claim descent from sky people, beings who came from the north, who possess supernatural abilities, who taught the secrets of spiritual flight, soul journeying, and communicating with non-physical entities. The Sami people of northern Scandinavia have oral traditions describing the first shamans as descendants of giants from the far north, beings who taught the use of the drum, the trance journey, the ability to see into other realms. These were not gods. These were teachers, ancestors, people with knowledge, Siberian shamans use Amanita muscaria mushrooms as sacraments, the red and white mushroom that appears in Christmas imagery, in fairy tales, in Alice in Wonderland. This mushroom produces visions, dissociation, out-of-body experiences, and according to shamanic tradition, it was taught to humans by the ancestors from the north. The Rig Veda describes soma, a sacred drink that granted immortality, divine vision, and communion with the gods. Scholars have debated soma's identity for centuries. Some argue it was a plant, others say it was a metaphor, but a growing number of researchers believe soma was Amanita muscaria, the same mushroom Siberian shamans use, the same mushroom that grows prolifically in northern latitudes. If Hyperboreans used entheogenic plants to develop consciousness technologies, if they mapped non-ordinary states with the same precision they mapped the stars, then shamanic traditions are not primitive superstition. They are the remnants of an advanced spiritual science, passed down through lineages, preserved in oral tradition, practiced by descendants who carry the genetic predisposition for these abilities. Modern populations carrying high concentrations of Hyperborean ancestry may still have access to these latent capacities, not through training, not through education, but through genetic inheritance, abilities encoded in DNA, dormant until activated by specific conditions, practices, or plants. This makes certain powerful groups very uncomfortable, because if consciousness abilities are heritable, if certain bloodlines carry genetic advantages in perception, intuition, or cognitive function, then equality becomes more complex. Not all humans would have the same potential. Not all lineages would carry the same inheritance. And that brings us to the modern elite, the families that control finance, politics, media, and technology. Look at their genealogies, trace their ancestry. You will find disproportionate representation of Northern European lineages, particularly families from regions with high concentrations of R1a and R1b haplogroups, families from areas where Rh-negative blood is most common. Is this coincidence? Or is there something about Hyperborean ancestry that conveys advantages in intelligence, strategic thinking, or leadership capacity? Advantages that, over generations, lead to accumulation of power and resources? The Rothschild family, the Rockefellers, European royal houses, old money dynasties across America and Europe, trace their bloodlines back far enough, and you find roots in the same regions: northern France, Germany, Scotland, Scandinavia, the Atlantic coast. Secret societies reinforce these connections. Skull and Bones at Yale University. Founded in 1832, limited to 15 members per year, exclusively male until the 1990s. Predominantly from old money families with genealogies tracing back to colonial, American, and European aristocracy. Their symbol is a skull with the number 322 beneath it. 322 is also written as Genesis 3:22 in some interpretations, referencing the biblical verse where God says man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil, becoming like gods, accessing forbidden knowledge. Skull and Bones members have gone on to positions of enormous power: 3 United States presidents, Supreme Court justices, CIA directors, Fortune 500 CEOs, not because the society itself wields power, but because membership signals something. Lineage, connection, belonging to a network that recognizes shared ancestry. Other societies follow similar patterns. The Freemasons at higher degrees, the Thule Society we discussed earlier, Rosicrucian orders. These are not conspiracies in the sense of shadowy cabals controlling the world. These are networks of families who recognize shared heritage and prefer to keep power within the bloodline. They do not advertise this. They do not publicly state that they believe they descend from Hyperborea or any lost civilization, but their symbolism tells the story. The eye in the pyramid, the phoenix rising from ashes, the pelican feeding its young with its own blood, all symbols of regeneration, of lineage continuing despite catastrophe, of bloodlines that survive when civilizations fall. And they study genealogy obsessively. Ancestry.com and 23andMe are consumer products, but elite families have been conducting detailed genealogical research for centuries. They know their bloodlines. They track genetic inheritance. They arrange marriages to concentrate desired traits. This is not speculation. This is documented historical practice. European royalty practiced consanguineous marriage, marrying cousins to keep bloodlines pure, for over 1,000 years. The Habsburg dynasty became so inbred that genetic disorders proliferated. The famous Habsburg jaw, hemophilia, in the Descendants of Queen Victoria. Why continue practices that led to genetic problems? Because the alternative Outbreeding completely meant losing whatever genetic advantages the bloodline carried. They chose to risk genetic disorders rather than dilute the lineage. What were they trying to preserve? Intelligence, health, longevity, or something less tangible? Intuition, psychic sensitivity, connection to ancestral knowledge encoded in genetic memory? Modern populations carrying Hyperborean ancestry do not have access to these family archives. They do not know their genealogies past a few generations. They do not practice strategic intermarriage, but the genetics persist, diluted, mixed, but present. And those genetics may carry more than physical traits. They may carry predispositions, tendencies, capacities that emerge under the right conditions. Some people feel a pull toward the north, an inexplicable connection to Nordic landscapes, mythology, or aesthetics, a sense of homecoming when they encounter Viking history or Celtic art, a resonance with shamanic practices or entheogenic spirituality. Is this just personal preference, cultural influence, or is it genetic memory, DNA responding to ancestral patterns? Recognizing what belonged to the lineage, you cannot prove genetic memory exists. Epigenetics shows that environmental experiences can alter gene expression and that these alterations can be inherited. Trauma can be passed down. Stress responses can be inherited. But memory? Actual information encoded in DNA? That is still theoretical. But what if Hyperborean knowledge was encoded not in written records, which can be destroyed, but in genetics? What if the survivors who scattered after the cataclysm carried their civilization's accumulated wisdom not in books but in their blood, passed down through generations, waiting to be activated? That would explain why certain individuals, with no training, no exposure, no cultural context, suddenly experience profound insights. Why some people naturally understand sacred geometry. Why some intuitively grasp astronomical cycles. Why some can enter trance states without instruction. Not because they are special, because they are remembering, accessing information inherited from ancestors who knew these things as science. The Hyperborean bloodline did not disappear. It diffused. It spread across continents. It mixed with other populations until the original lineage became a component of millions of people's ancestry. Most do not know they carry it. Most will never know. But the genetics persist. Silent, waiting, encoded in chromosomes, ready to activate when the time comes, when the conditions are right, when humanity needs to remember what the ancestors knew. The descendants of Hyperborea are not a separate race. They are not a master race. They are us, mixed, integrated, woven into the fabric of modern humanity. And the knowledge they carried is still here, in bloodlines, in genetics, in the potential that lies dormant in millions of people who have no idea what they are capable of. All they need is the key to unlock it. Academia is supposed to be about the pursuit of truth, the scientific method. Follow the evidence wherever it leads. Question assumptions. Test hypotheses. Revise understanding when new data emerges. That is the ideal. The reality is very different. Academic institutions are hierarchies. They have gatekeepers, peer review systems, funding committees, tenure boards, and all of these structures create incentives that have nothing to do with discovering truth. They create incentives to protect established narratives, to avoid controversy, to maintain the paradigm. Because paradigm shifts are dangerous, not to knowledge, to careers. Dr. Robert Schoch learned this the hard way. In 1990, he was a respected geologist at Boston University. He had credentials, published research, academic standing. Then he examined the Sphinx in Egypt and concluded, based on water erosion patterns, that it was thousands of years older than Egyptologists claimed. Not built in 2500 before Christ, built closer to 10,000 before Christ. His analysis was solid, geological, based on erosion science that any first-year geology student could verify. Water erosion requires sustained rainfall. Egypt has been arid for thousands of years, but 10,000 years ago, the Sahara was green, wet, rainfall was abundant. The erosion patterns on the Sphinx matched that time frame. Not the 4th dynasty, not Pharaoh Khafre, something much, much older. Egyptologists attacked him viciously. Not his geology. They could not challenge the erosion evidence. They attacked his credibility, his motivations. They accused him of seeking publicity, of pandering to pseudoscience, of undermining legitimate archaeology. Dr. Zahi Hawass, then Egypt's Minister of Antiquities, banned Schoch from conducting further research in Egypt, not because his methodology was flawed, because his conclusions were unacceptable. They threatened the established timeline. They suggested advanced civilization existed before Sumer, before Egypt, before the official start of history, and that could not be allowed. Schoch still has his position at Boston University. He still publishes, but his career took a hit. Funding became harder to obtain. Mainstream journals became less receptive. He became labeled as alternative, fringe, and in academia, those labels are career poison. The message was clear. Challenge the paradigm and face consequences. Graham Hancock is not an archaeologist. He is a journalist, a researcher. He writes books exploring alternative theories about lost civilizations, ancient catastrophes, and suppressed history. His books are bestsellers. Millions of readers, Netflix documentaries, and archaeologists despise him. Not because he fabricates evidence. He cites sources. He references studies. He interviews credentialed experts. But he asks questions. Mainstream archaeology refuses to ask. He follows implications they refuse to follow. In 2022, the Society for American Archaeology published an open letter condemning Hancock's Netflix series, Ancient Apocalypse. They called it dangerous, harmful, a threat to archaeological science. They demanded Netflix reclassify it as fiction rather than documentary. Why? What was so threatening? Hancock presents evidence of advanced pre-Ice Age civilizations. He discusses the Younger Dryas impact. He examines megalithic sites that do not fit conventional timelines. He interviews geologists like Schoch. He shows satellite imagery of underwater structures. He connects mythology to geological events. None of this is fabrication. He is not making up data. He is interpreting existing evidence through a different framework. A framework that suggests human civilization is older and more complex than we have been taught. And that terrifies institutional archaeology. Because if Hancock is right, if advanced civilizations existed before the accepted timeline, then decades of archaeological theory collapse. Textbooks need revision. Entire careers built on the Mesopotamian origin model become obsolete, so instead of engaging with the evidence, they attack the messenger. They call him a pseudoscientist. They accuse him of racism because some of his theories suggest knowledge transfer from advanced cultures to less advanced ones. They claim he is undermining indigenous achievements. None of these criticisms address the evidence. They are character attacks, designed to discredit without debate. This is the suppression mechanism, not government conspiracies, not men in black confiscating research, just institutional inertia, gatekeeping, career protection, paradigm defense. If you're a young archaeologist and you find something that does not fit the timeline, you have two choices: suppress your findings and advance your career, or publish your findings and become unemployable. Most choose career. Dr. Virginia Steen McIntyre experienced this directly. In the 1970s, she was part of a team dating artifacts from Hueyatlaco, an archaeological site in Mexico. Using multiple dating methods, uranium series, fission track, tetrahydration, they consistently got the same result. The artifacts were 250,000 years old, 250,000 years, in the Americas. That is impossible according to accepted history. Humans did not reach the Americas until 15,000 years ago, at the earliest. Some models push it back to 20 or 30,000 years, but 250,000 years? That would require advanced humans in the Americas before modern Homo sapiens even evolved. Steen McIntyre reported the findings, and her career ended. She was pressured to revise the dates, to retest using different methods, to find an error that would bring the results in line with expectations. She refused. The dates were solid. Multiple independent methods confirmed them. The artifacts were 250,000 years old. She was blacklisted. No university would hire her. Journals refused her papers. She became a cautionary tale, the archaeologist who let data destroy her career. The Hueyatlaco site was quietly closed to further research. The artifacts were stored, the findings were buried in obscure journals, and the mainstream timeline remained unchallenged. This pattern repeats across the field. Anomalous findings appear. Researchers report them. Institutions suppress them. Not through conspiracy, through systemic bias, through career incentives that reward conformity and punish deviation. Göbekli Tepe should have changed everything. A site from 11,600 years ago, megalithic temples, advanced astronomy, sophisticated carving, built by people who supposedly had not invented agriculture yet. Dr. Klaus Schmidt, who led the excavations until his death in 2014, spent decades trying to make sense of the site within conventional frameworks. He proposed that religion inspired civilization rather than the other way around, that people built the temples first, then developed agriculture to support the priesthood. Interesting theory. But it still does not explain where the knowledge came from. The astronomical understanding, the architectural skill, the organization required to move 20-ton stones without metal tools or domesticated animals. Schmidt avoided the obvious conclusion that the builders were not primitive hunter-gatherers inventing civilization from scratch, that they were descendants of an older, more advanced culture, that they were building from inherited knowledge rather than discovering it for the first time. Why did he avoid that conclusion? Because saying it out loud would have ended his career. Funding would have disappeared. Academic support would have evaporated. He would have become another Schock, another Hancock. Credible, correct, but dismissed. So he stayed within acceptable boundaries. He framed his findings in ways that challenged the timeline but not the fundamental narrative. And Göbekli Tepe became an anomaly, an exception, a mystery that mainstream archaeology acknowledges but does not pursue. The Arctic is particularly off-limits. Propose an expedition to search for Hyperborean ruins and watch funding requests get rejected, not because the proposal is unscientific, because the hypothesis is unacceptable. Arctic archaeology exists. Teams study Inuit sites, Norse settlements, Paleo-Eskimo cultures, all within the accepted time frame, all fitting the narrative of humans reaching the Arctic relatively recently, but propose searching for evidence of civilization in the Arctic from 12,000 years ago, propose excavating the structures found in Franz Josef Land, propose drilling into Antarctic subglacial lakes to search for biological evidence of ancient habitation? Rejected. Every time. The permits do not get approved. The funding does not materialize. The proposals get stuck in review committees indefinitely, and researchers learn not to ask, because asking damages your reputation. It marks you as unreliable, fringe, unserious. Dr. Charles Hapgood faced this throughout his career. His crustal displacement theory, his analysis of ancient maps, his evidence of advanced pre-Ice Age cartography, all ignored by mainstream geology and archaeology. Albert Einstein supported Hapgood's work, wrote a foreword to his book. Einstein saw the value in questioning assumptions, in following evidence, in considering catastrophic scenarios, but academia dismissed Hapgood anyway. Einstein's support meant nothing. Hapgood died in 1982, his theories still considered pseudoscience. Decades later, some of his ideas about rapid climate change and catastrophic events are being reconsidered, but he never received credit, never received vindication, because the institutions do not reward being right too early. They punish deviation, and they protect the paradigm. The Younger Dryas impact theory faced similar resistance. When it was first proposed in 2007, mainstream geology rejected it. No impact crater, not enough evidence. Alternative explanations were more plausible, but evidence kept accumulating. Platinum anomalies in the geological record, nanodiamonds formed under extreme pressure, widespread burn layers, megafaunal extinction, sudden climate shift, every marker of a major impact event. By 2020, the evidence was overwhelming. Papers published in Nature and Science confirmed the impact. But did the institutions apologize to the researchers who proposed it in 2007? Did they acknowledge suppressing valid research for over a decade? No. They quietly accepted the new paradigm and moved on. The researchers who were right from the beginning received no recognition, no vindication, just silent incorporation of their findings into the new consensus. This is how suppression works in academia, not through dramatic cover-ups, through bureaucratic indifference, through career incentives, through gatekeeping mechanisms that filter out uncomfortable truths before they reach public awareness. And the Arctic, Antarctica, and Hyperborea remain the most suppressed topics of all, because they do not just challenge timelines, they challenge the entire narrative of human origins. They suggest advanced civilization existed before the accepted start of history. They imply knowledge was lost, that humanity regressed, that we are not on a linear path of progress, but on a cycle of rise and fall. That is the dangerous idea. Not that Hyperborea existed, but that civilizations can fall, that knowledge can be lost, that progress is not inevitable, because if it happened before, it can happen again. And maybe, just maybe, some institutions would rather we not think about that too carefully. So what does all of this mean? What are we supposed to do with the information that an advanced Arctic civilization existed 12,000 years ago, that its descendants scattered across the world, that their genetics persist in modern populations, and that institutions actively suppress research into these origins, it means the story we have been told about human history is incomplete, not entirely wrong, but missing crucial chapters. We are taught that civilization began in Mesopotamia around 5,000 years ago, that before that, humans were primitive, hunter-gatherers with no architecture, no astronomy, no organized society, that progress has been linear, from caves to cities, from stone tools to smartphones, constant advancement. But the evidence tells a different story. It tells us that advanced knowledge existed before the supposed beginning, that megalithic construction, astronomical science, and sophisticated culture emerged fully formed in the archaeological record because they were not being invented, they were being remembered, reconstructed, passed down from survivors of an earlier age. The Younger Dryas cataclysm 12,800 years ago was not just a climate event, it was a reset, a destruction of existing civilizations so complete that what came after had to rebuild from fragments. The survivors carried knowledge, genetics, cultural memory, but they had lost the infrastructure, the cities, the accumulated libraries, and technology of their ancestors. So they did what survivors do. They adapted. They taught what they could to the populations they encountered. They built what they could with available resources, and they passed down stories, myths, legends, warnings about floods and catastrophes, and the hubris that brings civilizations low. Those myths are not primitive superstition. They are historical memory, encoded in narrative because narrative survives when written records burn. Stories last, and the story they tell, across every culture, is the same. There was an advanced age. It was destroyed. We are the descendants of the survivors. Hyperborea is not the only name for this lost world. Atlantis, Lemuria, Mu, the antediluvian civilizations. Different cultures remembered different aspects of the same global catastrophe. Atlantis was probably a real place, likely in the Atlantic, destroyed by rising seas and crustal displacement. Hyperborea was its northern counterpart, the Arctic civilization that froze when the climate shifted. Both existed, both fell, both left descendants who carried forward what knowledge they could preserve. And those descendants are us, not a separate race, not a hidden bloodline living in secret. Us, the people alive today, particularly those with Northern European, Central Asian, and Native American ancestry. The genetics prove it. We carry markers from the ghost population, from the ancient North Eurasian ancestry, from the people who lived in the far north before the ice came, which means the abilities, the knowledge, the potential that civilization possessed. It is not lost, it is dormant, encoded in genetics, waiting to be activated. This is not mysticism. This is epigenetics. We know that environmental conditions can activate or suppress gene expression. We know that trauma, stress, and experience alter which genes are active. We know these alterations can be inherited. What if advanced consciousness abilities, intuitive perception, enhanced cognitive function, these are not supernatural, they are genetic. Traits that were common in Hyperborean populations, that persist in descendants, but that require specific conditions to activate. Shamanic practices, entheogenic plants, meditation, breathwork, fasting, sleep deprivation, all of these alter brain chemistry, all of these change gene expression, all of these can potentially activate dormant capacities encoded in DNA. Modern populations are rediscovering these practices, not through academic study, through direct experience. People are using ayahuasca, psilocybin, DMT. They are practicing meditation, holotropic breathwork, and they are accessing states of consciousness that feel ancient, familiar, like remembering rather than learning. What if that feeling is accurate? What if these practices are unlocking genetic memory, accessing knowledge that was never lost, just suppressed, dormant, waiting for descendants to remember how to activate it? The elite families we discussed earlier, the ones obsessed with bloodlines and genealogy, they know this. They have preserved knowledge through secret societies and initiatory traditions for thousands of years, not because they are evil, not because they want to suppress humanity, but because they understand that certain knowledge requires preparation, that activating these capacities without proper context is dangerous. You cannot give advanced technology to a child. You cannot teach warfare to someone unstable. You cannot unlock consciousness abilities in someone unprepared for what they will perceive. So the knowledge was restricted, kept within lineages, passed down to those deemed ready, not to hoard power, to prevent catastrophe. But that era is ending. Information spreads too quickly now. Genetics testing is available to anyone. Entheogenic research is entering mainstream science. Meditation apps teach techniques that were once monastery secrets. The gatekeeping mechanisms are failing, which means the choice is becoming individual, not institutional. Each person carrying Hyperborean genetics can choose to explore that inheritance or not, to activate dormant capacities or leave them sleeping. There is no right answer. Activation brings insight, perception, connection to something vast and ancient, but it also brings responsibility, burdens, awareness of how much has been lost, how much needs to be rebuilt, because that is the real legacy of Hyperborea. Not just that an advanced civilization existed, but that it fell, that knowledge was lost, that humanity nearly went extinct, and that we are still recovering, still rebuilding, still trying to remember what the ancestors knew. Climate is changing again, faster than any time in recorded history except the Younger Dryas. Ice is melting. Sea levels are rising. We are entering another period of rapid environmental transformation, not as catastrophic as 12,000 years ago, not yet, but following a similar pattern, and as the ice melts, as the Arctic and Antarctic reveal what has been buried, we will face a choice. Do we acknowledge the evidence? Do we revise our understanding of history? Do we accept that advanced civilization existed before the accepted timeline, and that we are the descendants of survivors? Or do we suppress it, dismiss it, maintain the comfortable narrative that we are the pinnacle of human achievement, that nothing came before, that progress is linear and inevitable? The institutions will choose suppression. They always do. But individuals have another option. You can investigate your own ancestry, test your genetics, trace your haplogroups, see if you carry markers from the ghost population, the ancient North Eurasian component, the Rh-negative blood, the traits that point to Hyperborean lineage. And if you do, you can choose to explore what that means, not through institutions, through direct experience, through practices that activate genetic potential, through reconnecting with the knowledge your ancestors carried in their blood. This is not about racial superiority. Hyperborean descendants are not better than other humans. They are different. They carry a specific inheritance. But every human lineage carries inheritances. African populations carry genetic resistances to diseases. Asian populations carry adaptations to high altitudes. Polynesian populations carry navigational instincts encoded through millennia of ocean voyaging. We are all descendants of specialized populations that adapted to specific environments and developed specific capacities. Hyperborean genetics are just one lineage among many, one thread in the tapestry of human diversity, but it is a thread that connects to something vast, something old, something that institutional history has chosen to forget. And remembering it, reclaiming it, activating it, that is the legacy available to anyone willing to look past the official narrative and ask the question academia fears most. What if everything we have been taught about human origins is wrong? Not completely wrong, but incomplete, missing the chapters that were deliberately erased, the civilizations that were written out of history, the knowledge that was suppressed because it threatened power structures built on the myth of linear progress. Hyperborea did not disappear. It transformed. It scattered. It survived in bloodlines, in genetics, in myths, in monuments, scattered across the globe, in the DNA of millions of people who carry its legacy without knowing it. The descendants of Hyperborea are not a hidden race dwelling in underground cities. They are us, walking the streets, living ordinary lives, carrying extraordinary potential locked in chromosomes, waiting for the moment when the ice melts, when the truth emerges. When the time comes to remember, that time is now. The ice is melting, the evidence is emerging, the choice is yours. Will you remember, or will you forget? We have covered a lot of ground today, from Russian Arctic expeditions discovering impossible structures under the ice, to genetic evidence of ghost populations that do not fit the official timeline, from Nazi and Soviet races to claim polar secrets, to underground cavern systems and subglacial lakes that could harbor remnants of ancient refuges. From bloodlines preserved in European nobility to shamanic traditions keeping Hyperborean knowledge alive, from academic suppression mechanisms to the reality that these descendants are not hiding in shadows but walking among us, encoded in the DNA of millions. The evidence is there, the physical structures, the genetic markers, the classified expeditions, the institutional suppression, all pointing to the same conclusion. Hyperborea was real, its civilization fell, its people survived, and their legacy continues in bloodlines that stretch from the Arctic to every corner of the modern world. This is not the end of the story. this is just the beginning. Because if Hyperborea survived in Descendants, if its knowledge persists in genetic memory, then what other lost civilizations did the same? What happened to Atlantis? Where did its survivors go? What knowledge did they preserve? That is exactly what we are exploring next. The Atlantean connection, the sister civilization to Hyperborea, the empire that sank beneath the Atlantic while the North froze solid. Two catastrophes, two survivals, one global network of refugees who became the foundation of every ancient culture we know. If this investigation into hidden history resonates with you, if you want to keep digging deeper into the mysteries they do not teach in schools, subscribe now, hit that notification bell, because the rabbit hole goes much deeper than you think, and Mr. H will be your guide every step of the way. Drop a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me if you think you might carry Hyperborean genetics. Tell me what lost civilization you want us to investigate next. Your engagement keeps this research alive. Your curiosity drives us to dig deeper. The descendants of Hyperborea never disappeared. They just learned to hide in plain sight. And now, finally, their story is being told. Until next time, keep questioning, keep searching, and never stop seeking the truth they tried to bury. This is Mr. H, and the journey has only just begun.